Afternoon to all of you. I'll speak mostly in English, and I seek your permission for that because I was invited to comment on the Act, and the provisions of the Act are what I want to refer to. Wijesinghe කතා කරන්න. My involvement here is basically because in 2002, the Electricity Reform Act, which was, I think, the most progressive pieces of legislation, provided for the unbundling, which many countries throughout the world have done. We are doing it, or we proposed to do it in 2002, not because we wanted to follow any other country, but because unbundling of the electricity sector has been proven to be a very prudent step. Now, there may be minuses and pluses in other countries, but this is the way in which we go forward. Just like, although there is criticism about market economies, I think we were the first country in South Asia to go into the market economy. 1 year later, Deng Xiaoping of China did it, and 14 years later, Manmohan Singh of India did it. China remains a market economy to a large extent, so does India. So I don't think we took the wrong step. In the same manner, I think it's important to mention that permitting private participation within certain parameters was also tried and tested, in particular in 89 to 93. I was closely associated with those efforts and know the institutions of COPED, which later became PERC, which succeeded in doing a lot of good things. Yes, again, like in every country, everything that you do is not ideal. Moving on from there, if you come into the 2000 plus period, 2002 saw an attempt to do something a lot more than the post-77 era or the 89 to 93 era. What the Act in 2002 intended to do was to bring the CEB and LECO, collapse it and redistribute it. So my question number one, a question I had on the 15th of February at the Chartered Institute is, why is LECO kept separately to be spun off? Because that Act of 2002, when it provided for the unbundling and the successor companies, it also provided for what is called a monitoring and advisory committee. The role of the monitoring and advisory committee, and it is very relevant in today's context, because the apparent equivalent is the National Electricity Advisory Council. Now, what did the Monitoring Advisory Committee, it was constituted by, not by ministers' appointments, and that's a fundamental difference between the 2002 Progressive Act and today's Act, with no offense to anybody. I think we need to be more progressive than we were 22 years ago. What did the MAC, how was it constituted? A nominee of the Institute of Engineers and the chairman of LECO, who was a member of the IESL, was a nominee. A nominee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, I was appointed to that position. A nominee of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, a deputy secretary to the Treasury, an assistant secretary to the Ministry of Power and Energy, a representative nominated by the Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs to look at the interests of consumer protection. So if the gentleman who was the LECO chairman at the time was on that committee, Charita P. De Silva from the Ceylon Chamber came on that committee, I from the Institute of Chartered Accountants, Mr. Padmanathan, Deputy Secretary Treasury, Professor K.K.Y.W. Perera, everybody knows about him in the power sector. And we had named people from different sources of nomination. It was, the minister was allowed to appoint only 2 people. And he appointed Maxi Prelis, engineer, who was also chairman CB at one time, and Patrick Amarasinghe from the Federation of Chambers. So we, and then, since there was no provision for a chairman, the committee got together and appointed me chairman. What was our task? If the successor companies were Genco, Transco, Disco, generation, transmission, distribution, and service companies, which were called the successor companies, we as the Monitoring and Advisory Committee were tasked with the independent identification and proposal to the Minister of directors of the successor companies. That is also not there in the current act. So if I may repeat, there was a Monitoring and Advisory Committee which was not dominated by the sector minister or any minister of any kind or by the cabinet. It comprised of people whose source of nomination was either Institute of Engineers, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Federation of Chambers, Consumer Protection, and so on. And this committee of mine got together, we met, and mind you, I'll repeat, we met every week in the Flower Road office of the minister. We charged not a single cent. Today I know JICA funds all consultants. It was not provided for, neither did we want, but we worked very hard. And we had to identify, first, let me stop there to say, in order for us to identify the directors to the successor companies, I wanted to see models all over. I found the electricity reform of New Zealand perhaps the best, where they advertise positions for the public sector. They give criteria, not just anybody. But I thought if we do that, I will have a fundamental rights case against me and the committee. So we decided to take the chambers, the organization of professional associations, and a wide cross-section of about 40 sources of nominees, and each one was asked to nominate, based on criteria, of course, people who would fit the bill: electrical engineers, electronic engineers, civil engineers, mechanical engineers, accountants, lawyers, marketers, and so on. And believe you me, we came across over 100 nominations. We rejected several for conflicts of interest. I'll repeat. No less than the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce nominated people, the apex chamber of this country, a person who was also in a company that was an independent power producer at the time. We rejected that name. There were people who were nominated who didn't have the necessary background. I and a few members of my committee met several of our nominees, and we came out with an outstanding number of 70 directors. Now also, the Monitoring and Advisory Committee's role is that they nominate and recommend to the minister. That Act of 2002 also says very clearly that the minister shall, now no offense to any minister, good or bad or ugly is not the issue here. It is about the independence we seek. Now there is a perception that the engineers of the CEB are the ones who block reform for the last 30 years that I know. But I can say publicly in Hyde Park in Sri Lanka, Hyde Park London, or Hyde Park New York, that it is because the engineers that I have been motivated to share my knowledge, and it is because the engineers union, professional engineers, and I would like to at this time, with a lot of sadness, mention the name of Lakshita Wijesinghe. Right, Isuru? Did I pronounce his last name right? Yes. And he is a dear departed colleague, and I really wish he were here. Very independent, very objective, and perhaps one among, Tilak, correct me if I'm wrong, one among a handful of energy planners of the world, not just of Asia. We lost him, right? But he was there on the 15th of February at the CA Sri Lanka seminar, And what I want to mention here is, as a result of the richness of the engineers, the perception that if they are part of a union, they're bad. Not necessarily so. Because I have the courage and the nerve to challenge anyone who is against desirable reform. We titled that seminar on the 15th, Facilitating Desirable Reform. Reform must have a purpose. Reform is not just because anybody else said or the IMF said. We do reform of the balance sheet of the country because we think it is good for us. Not because somebody somewhere from the IMF said or the World Bank said or the ADB said. I've said this publicly. I can see Pial, my friend in the audience, he knows I've said it 30 years ago. It's not because it's stylish and faddish to say it today. But the purpose of the Monitoring and Advisory Committee was to evaluate a statement of corporate intent, SCI, of every successor company. And if the Monitoring and Advisory Committee did not like it, then we could reject it and put it back on the drawing board of the company, whether it's a Genco company, whether it's a Transco, or whether it's any one of the discos. And we recommend it to the minister. Also, let me get back to what I started and couldn't finish, I think. It provides for the minister shall not appoint or terminate any director otherwise than through the Monetary Advisory Committee. Now that is, I think, the most fundamental difference between the 2002 Progressive Act and today's Act. We are not saying that every minister is bad, but I think perception versus reality. Now, why is it even more compellingly important to me? The long-term generation expansion planning is one of the most important exercises or activities of the energy sector. Who decides that? And what is the role? Now also let me be a little general. I referred to 77, the market economy. Many people think, even in the United States of America, even in France, even in Venezuela, that the විවෘත ආර්ථිකය මතක ඇති කිසිම අගෞරවයකට නැතුව මම කියන්න ඕනේ ප්‍රෙසිඩන්ට් කුමාරතුංගයි මම විහිළු කරනවා එතුමියට පමණක් වෙලාවට හමු වුණාම she said විවෘත ආර්ථිකය විවෘත වනයක්. The open economy is open wound. That's old fashioned thinking. A market economy has to have regulation. It's not freedom of the wild entrepreneur. That is why you have the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka. We give license to banks, but the central bank is the supervisor, the monitor. Withdraw licenses, cancel it if they don't perform their role. You give a license to Dialog and Airtel and Mobitel, but the Telecom Regulatory Commission comes in. You give a license for people to do insurance, you bring in the Insurance Regulatory Commission. Those are only a few examples I'm giving. So a market economy has to have regulation. And that is why the tariff at the last seminar on the 15th, I questioned, and Tilak gave an excellent answer, so did Lakshita. What is tariff? Tariff is what we consume. Is that tariff fair? We found it was not fair. I can say publicly that I said there even then that the government must get back on the drawing board. No offense to the minister or the president of the country who I have worked with very closely on many occasions. And they dropped, they reduced the tariff. If tariff is what we consume it at homes, we consume it at companies. A country cannot be competitive. We have to be an export-led country. We have a small market. We have to export.
2 minutes more.
So therefore, in order to do that, we have to be competitive. Electricity is a fundamental ingredient in our production. So it has to be competitive. So if the tariff is not fair, you go down to the cost. And we say the cost is what? People talk a lot about cost reflective. I don't think the IMF comes and takes a look at the details of the cost. I am a chartered accountant. I challenged that cost on the 15th of February, and I challenge it even today. So if you run a company උදාහරණයකට අපි කියමු තලගුලි හදනවා කියලා. මුළු ලංකාවේම තලගුලි හදන එකම කම්පැනියක් තියෙනවා නම්, if I am buying the hakuru and other things wrong, I jack up my price because I am inefficient. Am I going to get people to consume that talaguli? No. We have to see whether we can take a look at the balance sheet of this entity called the CEB. So I am hopeful that much of this, what we are talking about as restructuring, will happen in the desirable manner. Time does not give me enough room to talk about other things. The Consumer Affairs Authority Act in this country, I was on the first Consumer Affairs Council in 2002. So just give me 2 minutes on this. I think Member of Parliament Charita Herath has written a letter to the Minister, and it is the public domain. I very confidently can say much of what the oppositions and politicians in Parliament today talk about is also generated by rich thinking of the unions and by some of what we did on the 15th of February and at the Gamini Korea Foundation here. But the Consumer Affairs Authority Act already provides for abuse of monopoly power. No offense to Mr. Dhammika Perera or the people who make beer. We have a monopoly in beer manufacture. We have a monopoly in cigarette manufacture. They are all feeding the government with a lot of excise money, true. We have monopolies in the tile sector. We have monopolies all over. We cannot and must not have a monopoly or duopoly or an abuse of monopolistic behavior which will generate a tariff, a cost and consequently a tariff that is in conflict with consumer protection. I'm only going to mention this. The Broadlands Power Project came for evaluation by me as an independent consultant as far back as 98. The Smoky Mountain Energy Corporation from Australia and another party from Malaysia presented, and the story went, engineers in the CEB are preventing this because they are looking for Santosam. I looked at it and I told the guys who proposed it in 98 to go back on the drawing board. The tariff they were asking per unit was not fair, right? So I will close this by saying, if the minister is going to be the final arbiter of long-term generation planning, who gets licenses and so on and so forth, then I think there is something critically, crucially, and very recklessly wrong, and therefore we need to get back to the drawing board in this act, or the responsible opposition who should be seeking reform will have to generate good thinking in Parliament and suggest amendments to this act. Thank you.